Welcome to the Sci-Fi Shorts podcast, the podcast for both readers and writers in the sci-fi genre. Here is your host into the worlds beyond, J Charles Ramirez.
All right, welcome readers and writers to the inaugural episode of the Sci-Fi Shorts podcast. With me today is a career tech entrepreneur whose writing was molded by sci-fi greats such as Asimov and Heinlein. Jim Dutton, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm proud to be part of the podcast and the first part of it. So that's good.
First episode, of course. Yes. So, just so everybody is aware of what we'll be moving forward, we're just having a small interviews just to meet the writers, like usual. So, to that front, you've mentioned to me before, Jim, that your inspirations to write came from your teenage years. But when did you really feel compelled to begin writing your own stories rather than just read them?
Yeah, well, I've always tinkered with writing, even though I'm a STEM nerd, so I avoided all writing courses and never really learned it. But even I remember sitting in the back seat of my parents' car driving cross country and writing in a spiral notebook. My first novel was titled World War III. I only got through one spiral notebook, so I never finished it. But the point at which I really thought that I might be able to write something that readers wanted to read was later. In '93, actually, I had a job that made me travel, that let me travel a lot, like every week. And so I did a lot of writing. I would sit in an airport, find the busiest gate, watch people, and make up stories about them.
Right.
And I submitted one of those to a writers' conference at Rice University in Houston. And surprisingly to me, the short story won first place. So,
wow.
And I got some great feedback actually from some published authors there. So,
yeah, I'm much the same way. Back in high school, and I kind of shied away from creative pursuits and stuff like that. I didn't really hit my stride when it comes to writing, painting, and other kinds of creative outlets until I was an adult. In fact, when I first started reading, really like intense reading, was when I took a job where I was sat in a booth for 8 hours at a time with little to no work. So I was just by myself, no phone connection, so I couldn't use the internet. So what do? You pick up a book and you start reading, and that really jump started like my love for that kind of work. Because before then I was always interested in science fiction and fantasy. I mean, who didn't, love Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, stuff like that. But I've always stuck to visual media. But it wasn't until I was really, I didn't have much other to do other than read that I started to understand really how much it meant to me. And that kind of drove my own foray into my own writing career here now. But I mean,
yeah.
I stick to one genre, basically, like science fiction and fantasy. I mean, they're really two separate things, but they're very closely related. But it seems that beyond sticking to speculative fiction, your work really kind of runs across several different kinds of writing, from science fiction to poetry, and even, as you put it on Medium, the philosophy of math and science. What do you think drew you to such varied styles of writing?
Well, yeah. Originally, I was driven by science fiction. Science fiction I grew up in the heyday, the peak of the golden years of sci-fi, and so I read a lot of these stories when they first were published. But I never actually wrote a lot of sci-fi when I was tinkering with writing all these years. I wrote short fiction actually, and so. But it's all kind of just the same thing. I write fiction about, relationships between people and love and loss and, all of that stuff. And then the science nerd part of me writes I call it philosophy of science and math, because it's actually a series about a certain set of theorems across a bunch of different disciplines. And then sci-fi is the mixture of those two things. It's it's writing engaging stories about people in a future or sci-fi environment of some sort. And so that's kind of the combination. And I get my fix for both things in writing in sci-fi stories. Poetry, I have no idea how that happened, and I've never written poetry before. I started writing on Medium. I now have a whole book that I published of poems. So Not sure how that happened, but glad it did.
Well, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I mean, most stories are rooted in character interactions, and science fiction has always been used kind of as a way to kind of have some heavy-handed like suggestions about society and what people are really going through in life. And it's just, sometimes people don't see it unless you slap it across, their face. So like, well, this is the reality of the world we're living in. But this is just like a fictionalized aspect where you turn all those knobs up to 11. And it's just like, well, this is capitalism shot through the moon. This is, globalization, industrialization, all those massive changes in reality in our real world reflect really well in science fiction. And it's just an easy way for people to, criticize or agree with what's going on in the world. And, I've always been drawn to that kind of exposition where you just take what concerns you
Right.
about the real world and you just create these giant fantastical representations of those things and hope that the satire or the commentary that you have on it resonates with people.
Yeah, sci-fi always has gotten a little bit of a bad rap in that regard. It's not really literature and all of the complaints about it. But partly that's just because so much of it was being written in the 60s and 70s, and now again today. There's so much of it out there that inevitably some of it is really good and some of it is not so good. And
Yeah.
but if you read novels like A Canticle for Leibowitz or Fahrenheit 451 or Foundation, any of those things, that's literature with this exaggeration, exaggerated viewpoint that you just mentioned, that allows you to examine some things that you couldn't do if you were writing a realistic novel.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, talking about some of these older works such as Foundation and Fahrenheit 451, you're also, you seem to be something of a sci-fi historian especially for our group here at Sci-Fi Shorts. You've been writing some really amazing blog posts about the intricacies of science fiction. And I've seen some pretty good conversation come from those things. I mean, specifically, you break it down based on like what you see in science fiction. Have you always found like the foundations in the history of sci-fi fascinating like that?
I have, yeah. I mean, I think Rod Castro started calling me the resident historian. What he really wanted to say was, I'm the really old guy who writes sci-fi still. I mean, there's two ways to become a historian. You can either read a lot about it or you can live through it. And I pretty much lived through it. So the really classic short stories and novels that were published by Asimov and Heinlein and all of those guys happened either just before I was able to read them or during that time when I was able to read them. So they were hot off the presses as far as I was concerned then, and it was all new, and it was all different, and it was all unheard of, really. I mean, nobody had seen anything like some of the stuff that was written back there, and some of it just stuck with me. I mean, it just hit me in the gut. So I didn't forget that. I forgot a lot of stuff, but I didn't forget the sort of feeling of the golden age of science fiction, where these sorts of things would come out in pulp. And for a penny a word, these guys would write these amazing stories. So I mean, that's kind of what got me interested in thinking about and writing about the history. I actually did this when I was for Sci-Fi Shorts on Medium. One of my one of my missions there, given by Rod and J.A., was to sort of pull new authors into it. And so I wrote a bunch of monthly prompts there, many of which contained some of the history that we've moved over now to the blog.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, as far as those kind of blog posts go, I did want to talk more about a piece that you had written called Theology in Science Fiction. That struck me because most of my work, it always deals with theology in one form or another. I'm always looking to write about contact with godlike beings, some unanswerable questions that it seems like all humans are curious about. What do you think drives that kind of curiosity in science fiction in particular?
Well, it's because sci-fi and theology are concerned with some of the same exact things. In the post that I wrote, I start out by saying science fiction has always been concerned. Science fiction has a long history of writing about long histories, which is true.
Yeah.
I mean, Foundation, for God's sake, or The Last Question. I mean, that's a short story that covers pretty much all of human existence, right? So when you do that, and when you write science fiction that concerns itself with the beginning of the world and the end of the world, and how the ethics and morality about how we treat each other and how we treat other beings, including robots, naturally there's going to be a lot of overlap with theology because it's concerned with the same sorts of things there. I think there's a quote by Heinlein that I always remembered. He said, theology is like searching in a dark basement for a black cat that isn't there. And I love that quote. And if you just substitute science fiction for the word theology, it still kind of works. Except that we're a lot more honest about the fact that the cat isn't there.
Yeah, that's true. I've always been drawn to that sort of thing, and especially in world building, theology turns out to be such a huge part of creating some sort of like unique cultures and peoples. It seems that if you have a group, or if you're writing a story about a group, there has to be faith in there somewhere. There has to be something that the people tend to worship, even if it's technology, that's still a theological kind of base. And it's speaking about theology and technology, I did want to talk about in particular your latest piece on Sci-Fi Shorts, which is called The Creative. Specifically, there's this really interesting connection that you created using this code line that starts with create and ends with amen. And the setting is a sort of matrix-like simulation. The connection between that prayer-like create amen and your characters had to have been intentional. And the relation between that and the tangible God that you create as the creative is really fascinating. What do you think? What drove you to explore that kind of idea?
A couple of things. And one thing I should point out before I spend too much time talking about theology, I'm not a theologist. And in fact, I'm not even a particularly religious person, but I do enjoy writing sci-fi. And as I said, that ends up talking about the same sorts of topics a lot. I'm also inspired by religious writings, the Bible in particular, and I wrote a whole series of articles about of science fiction stories inspired by the Book of Job, for example. This story, The Creative, was inspired by a couple of different things. One technology and one not technology, I guess. The technology part is this bizarre vault over the gap by programs like ChatGPT and Midjourney and so forth, things that we're using now on a production basis. My thought was, what if all these things just sort of combine together into one giant system, and all creation, everything that was created on Earth, whether it's novels or art or music or whatever, is done by this one system that's out there, and that's what I call the creative. So that's the kind of technology part. The theological part is, once I did that and began thinking of it as the creative, obviously there's a short jump to the creator, and so it becomes godlike. And furthermore, when people make requests of it, they're like prayers. And so when I wrote that initially, and also just a very practical device, I needed a way to terminate the requests that people were making of the creative. When you go to Midjourney, I don't know if you've ever used Midjourney, but there you type /imagine and then your prompt and then carriage return. Well, the carriage return doesn't come across if you're speaking the requests, the prompts, which is what was happening, what the characters are doing in the story. So I needed a way to terminate the request. When I chose Amen, actually generated a lot of discussion on the writers group, because that really, it's in your face at that point that this is about God and religion and so forth. Generally, I try to leave that to be a little bit introspective, but here, it just came out. I argued that the word amen actually has a Greek root that means something like "so be it," and it's not really. It wasn't originally a religious kind of thing, but it's used in exactly the same way in prayers. It's basically you're telling God, "Okay, I'm done with my prayer, my request that the UT Longhorns win this football game. Now I'm going to go drink beer and curse. So don't listen anymore." Right? Amen.
Yes, I agree, and that's like I was speaking with you earlier about this, that the nuance of words, it really adds a lot of depth to what you're saying, because like you said, that amen is just a Greek word that meant "so be it." It wasn't really its inception wasn't really like a religious thing, but then it became that strong religious connotation as that word itself, the Greek word, persisted throughout generations and languages. I mean, you can't go to any type of Christian or secular church where they don't use the word amen instead of "so be it." But when it first began, that's what it was. It was just another word that was used in the language, but it's taken on a whole new life now. So including that in your work really does add such a tremendous amount of depth. And the part really that stuck out to me about your work was that very final prayer, that very final line there. The character Leah wanted to meet Giorgio outside. Now, this last bit really branches out in a lot of very fascinating ways, because you could just take so many different threads on that. It's the simplicity of it's very artful, but asking the creative itself to either generate an approximation of what the real world is, or to let them out of the simulation entirely. Now that I think was just, like I said before, very artfully done.
Thank you. As a writer, I don't know whether this is generally true, but for me, coming from a tech background and becoming a writer, my tendency is always to try to explain everything. And that's what I want to do. I want to tell you everything, and I want to make sure the reader understands. When I put something that's a nuance in the story, I want to make sure that call it out as a nuance, right? And of course, that's one of the wonderful things about writing flash fiction and flash science fiction is you just don't have the word count to do that.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, and I think in this case, for example, I sort of reached the word limit, and I needed to somehow escape from that scene and go to the next scene. And the easiest way to do it was to leave that up in the air. And I do think that it adds a lot to the story. And I know reading back over it myself now, it like you said, it branches off into a lot of different directions. And now the reader gets to experience all those different directions. Whereas if I had actually just come out and said what I think happened there, it would cut off all those different options.
Of course. And again, to harp on that theological side that I've been really itching to talk about, this brought the beginning of your story back into question for me. Was Leah ever truly outside if she was still under the influence or the sphere of power from the creative? And was she able, it seemed, to return back into the simulation of her free will and on her own time? Well, is she truly free then if she's still under that influence? And what does freedom really mean? And I thought
and now there's a very small step to theology and really extrapolating those questions into real life and asking them about ourselves in reality.
Yeah, I mean, what does freedom mean? And I think that was just such a great kind of thing to impinge on in that kind of story. It's a very straightforward path for where the character's journey goes, but really the questions that are posed are like the meat and potatoes of that story. Because like I've always thought the best mark of a great piece of flash fiction is the questions it leads you to ask yourself, the things that stick with you. And when I write my own flash fiction, I always aim for something like that. I always tell myself, you read it for 5 minutes, but you want to think about it for 5 hours or more. And your story truly hit the nail on the head, at least for me, because as I was reading it, I was thinking about these kinds of questions and asking myself these things. And then when I was done reading, I found myself thinking of the story later on, hours down the line, because just something popped in my head. It was just like, well, is that really freedom? How does that reflect in my own self.
Yeah, and I think another tendency in science fiction writing, not a tendency, it's more of a habit at this point, is to put a twist at the end. And if you're not careful with that twist, if you're too heavy-handed with, and now this happened, you kind of lose the whole effect of the story at that point. And so, to me, having the story end in a question rather than a statement is often an effective way of doing it, which is good. And by the way, those kinds of questions can be approached. The big theological questions about free will and whether there is room for faith in a place, a society where science and math have run the gamut and solved all the problems. Those are the kinds of questions that fascinate me, and I write fiction about it. And also my nonfiction stories are about the approach of that through science and math, through actual theorems. How far can we go? What can we understand? What are we allowed to know about the universe? And everything else is going to be faith. There's just no way around it.
Yeah, I agree totally. It's just such a fascinating thing, and it's something that everybody kind of is drawn to. Like I said, you have humans are just naturally curious about things that we can't know. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, again, like you said, just leaving these stories up to the imagination instead of hand feeding questions and answers, I think is the mark of a great story, because really what the reader gets out of what you write, I feel is more important than what the writer intends sometimes, because everybody experiences life differently. And the way that a story affects you and the questions it makes you ask yourself, it just involves yourself so much more in writing and in faith and belief and just that human condition. And I that's what I really, really love about writing science fiction. But anyways, thank you so much for joining us.
By the way, I just want to point out the last line of Asimov's famous short story is something I always remember when I'm writing. The last line was, "Let there be light." And that was a great story and a great last line. So anyway.
No, hey, look, that's a great thing to keep in mind. But thank you so much for joining us at Sci-Fi Shorts podcast today, Jim. It's really been a pleasure to dive into your psyche and your work itself. Is there anything that you have in the works right now?
Working on a bunch of stuff, continuing to write flash fiction and shorts in a lot of different areas. There is one thing that I'm very proud of that I've just recently completed, which was a poem that was included in a book, not that I published, but it was published by Delise Larkin over on the Lark publication. And like I said, I never thought of myself as a poet, but I'm very proud of that particular poem and others that I've written. And I'm very proud to be part of that book. She's actually selling it on Amazon, and 100% of the proceeds there go to cancer research. So go look up something called Butterfly Dance, Passionate Poetry. That's the name of the book. And my poem in it is Forgetting Yesterday.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Definitely going to check that out myself. But if you want to see more of Jim's work, check out his author profile over at sci-fi-shorts.co. You can check out his library of past works on Medium. And you can also grab a copy of his newest poetry collection, Ghost Creek Murmurings, on Amazon. Now, for all of us here at Sci-Fi Shorts, happy writing and good luck exploring your own worlds beyond.
Sci-Fi Shorts and the Sci-Fi Shorts podcast are products of SFS Publishing. Music by Valence.